Well, welcome to the webinar, our 138th CG seminar, but our 6th webinar. So great to have you, and we'll look forward to a really interesting hour. I'm Simon Marginson. I'm the director of the centre and also Professor of Higher Education at the University of Oxford. And today we're going to introduce Sazana Jayadeva, who's from UCL, and she will talk to us about student mobility and social media. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the focus is on Germany and India. My very first introduction into global studies was Arjun Appadurai's wonderful book in the 1990s, which was essentially saying that identity changes now because of media. People sustain a continuing relationship with their country of origin. They don't, when they move, they don't migrate permanently in some sort of black and white sense from one world into another, but they remain connected and they become more multiple in their orientation. And this is one of the essential underlying strands of research on international student mobility, that we recognise the multiplicity and hybridity of peoples as they move. I'll quickly take you through the web protocols. Some of you will be familiar with these already. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website in due course. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted. Please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or you want to ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please turn it on when you're asking a question. We recommend using speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. You can ask questions during the webinar or at the end of the presentation. There are two ways to get my attention to ask a question. I mean, you can use the raised hand button, which is found in the participants section of Zoom, or you can, and I think this is more effective, get my attention by asking a direct question of Sazana in the chat section. That I would recommend doing this because it helps me to sort the questions and identify where questions are coming from, so we get a good representation during the Q&A session. When you're invited to ask a question, unmute yourself, which is a step we often forget. Switch on your video and then state your name and where you are from, and then ask your question. So I think, Sazana, we're just about ready, and let me say something about you. We're very pleased to welcome you today. You're a postdoctoral researcher at UCL. You're working with Rachel Brooks on the Euro Students Project, and you were formerly at Surrey. And the Euro Student Project is a comparative study of how the contemporary higher education student is conceptualized in 6 different European countries. And Rachel told us about that project last week. Mm-hmm. So without any further ado, Sazana, it's over to you.
Thank you. I'm just gonna quickly share my screen. All right, perfect. So thanks so much, everyone, first of all, for being here this afternoon. The title of my presentation is Engineering Mobility, an ethnographic study of how social media platforms are mediating transnational student mobility from India to Germany. Can everyone see the slides? Yeah? Perfect, okay. So there has been a dramatic increase in the number of Indians who are going to Germany for their higher education. As you can see, between 2008 and 2019, there was almost a 500% increase. The vast majority of Indian students in Germany are postgraduate students enrolled on engineering and IT courses. And for Germany today, India is now the second most important source of foreign postgraduate students after China, and the single largest source of foreign students who study engineering and information technology at the postgraduate level. So these rising flows from India to Germany are a result of a number of different factors. To begin with, the extremely affordable cost of education in Germany. Most courses in Germany are free, even for international students. Moreover, German universities are offering an increasing number of courses in English. The German government has also introduced a number of policies to make it easier for recent graduates of German universities, foreign graduates, to more easily transition into the labor market. Finally, the popularity of Germany as a study destination among Indians is also closely related to the unfavorable job market for engineers in India at the moment. However, all of this is really another paper, and in today's webinar, I'm going to be focusing mainly on the role of social media in mediating student mobility from India to Germany. So, in the scholarship on student migration, the role of online media and social media in facilitating student mobility has received only passing mention. Scholarship on social media and mobility has tended to focus mainly on the important role of social media in helping transnational families manage long-distance relationships and in helping migrants remain in contact with their social networks back home. However, there is a relative dearth of research that has ethnographically explored how social media might be more directly informing mobilities, meaning how it might be used by aspirant migrants, in this case, prospective international students, to actually plan their migration. The small number of existing studies which have considered the role of social media in crafting mobility in this manner have rightly drawn attention to how social media can significantly expand an aspirant migrant's social networks beyond their close contacts or their strong ties. These studies have discussed how such media allow aspirant migrants to not just reconnect with their weak ties or their distant acquaintances, but also establish contact with latent ties, or people who were previously unknown to them, but connected to them via the structure of the internet. So while weak ties and particularly latent ties are seen as really important for organizing migration because they typically give an aspirant migrant access to pools of contacts and types of information that they wouldn't be able to find through their existing social networks. Existing scholarship has tended to portray the impact of these latent ties in the facilitation of migration as being quite limited. So studies have argued that when an aspirant migrant goes on social media to get migration information, they're typically talking with people whom they already knew. And as a result, these studies have described social media as not really increasing the social capital of an aspirant migrant in a significant manner. However, in today's webinar, I'm going to offer a case study of how social media communities on Facebook and WhatsApp were enabling people who were previously completely unknown to each other to connect with each other and support each other through the process of applying to study in Germany. So to give you a quick structure of the talk, in section 1, I'll quickly run you through my fieldwork. And in section 2, I'll really describe how these social media mutual help groups worked. And then I'll have a quick conclusion. In the abstract that some of you might have read, I had also said that I would be looking at new forms of education consultancy that have emerged on social media. However, unfortunately, when the CGHE seminars moved online, the amount of time that we have to present has been reduced. So in this talk, I'll be mainly focusing on the social media communities and how they facilitate migration. But if you're interested in knowing more about new forms of consultancy that have emerged in these spaces, we can discuss it in the Q&A, and you're also most welcome to email me to discuss these topics further. So moving on to my fieldwork, the bulk of the fieldwork for this project was conducted between 2017 to 2018, and I also did a little bit of follow-up fieldwork in 2020. This fieldwork involved digital ethnographic research within 4 Facebook groups and 15 WhatsApp groups that were used by aspirant student migrants or prospective students in India to plan how to go to Germany for study, I'll tell you more about these groups later, so might not make much sense right now, but I'll tell you more about this later. In addition, I conducted interviews with 40 Indian students who were studying at 17 different German universities. The vast majority of these students were studying for an engineering postgraduate course, and the vast majority were male, which is representative of the demographic of Indian students in Germany. So, the vast majority of my interlocutors perceived the process of organizing to go abroad to study as being very complicated and stressful. So right from trying to understand the landscape of the higher education system in a foreign country, to figuring out how to shortlist universities, to negotiating the application process, all of this was experienced as really stressful. My interlocutors came from across India, and they included people who were from metropolitan cities, smaller cities and towns, and even villages. Although all of my interlocutors described themselves as coming from middle-class families, there was a lot of variation in socioeconomic background. The majority said that it was affordable education in Germany that had even made it possible for them to consider going abroad to study. And almost none of them had seen study abroad as being an anticipated part of their trajectories. Most did not have people in their existing social networks who could help them navigate the process of going to Germany for study. Furthermore, commercially run education consultants or agents were seen as being very unreliable and uninformed when it came to study in Germany. I'll explain this a little bit. So in India, education consultants are widely seen as an important source of information and guidance on study abroad. They offer prospective international students support with the entire application journey, right from shortlisting universities to preparing application documents. Most have partnerships with foreign universities who give them commissions for recruiting students. So they are able to offer their services to prospective international students for free, which contributes to their popularity. Nevertheless, they have quite a mixed reputation, and narratives of them being sources of guidance and support coexist with narratives of them being these really profit-driven actors who put their business interests before their clients' interests. Now, this entire thing is a lot more complicated in the case of Germany, because as I've already said, most universities in Germany do not charge tuition fees even to international students. So they have very little incentive to actually partner with an education consultant in India and pay them to recruit students. And this means that consultants don't really have any incentive to recommend Germany to their clients. So a lot of my interlocutors had stories about how they had gone to an education consultant with an explicit desire to study in Germany, and the consultant had actively discouraged them from thinking about Germany and had suggested, why don't you think about Australia or Latvia or Poland or one of the countries where they had partnerships. So it was in this context of aspirant student migrants feeling very nervous and unsupported that these social media communities that I'll talk about had become really key migration infrastructures. So at the time of my fieldwork, there were several large and vibrant Facebook groups that were focused on study in Germany. You can see that this group, for instance, if you look at the bottom of the screenshot, has over 20,000 members. So most of these groups had been created by Indians who were studying in Germany as a way to support others in India who might also be interested in coming to Germany. With names like MS in Germany, Masters of Science in Germany, or Indian Students in Germany, these groups were quite broad in terms of focus, and they brought together anyone who had an interest in studying in Germany. While not all 20,000 members were very active, each Facebook group had hundreds of active members. Most of these active members were aspirant student migrants, but there were also a small number of seniors, meaning Indians who were already studying in Germany or who had recently graduated from a German university, who were quite active in responding to people's posts. Members would use these Facebook groups to post questions about German universities, about the application process, and posting one's question in the Facebook group would allow one to solicit the views and the perspectives of a large number of people. It was not uncommon for a member's questions to receive 50 to 100 responses. Now, these Facebook groups were also a gateway into the significantly greater number of WhatsApp groups that existed. People would use the Facebook groups to advertise WhatsApp groups they had created, posting the links to these groups so that others who were interested could join the group. Unlike the Facebook groups, many of the WhatsApp groups tended to be more specialized, which allowed for in-depth discussions on all topics study in Germany related. For instance, there were WhatsApp groups based on discipline, there were WhatsApp groups based on university, groups specifically for people who wanted to study a specific course at a specific university, groups for people who wanted to discuss the visa applications, and all such groups might have subgroups based on city or state of residence in India. Just like the slogan, "There's an app for that," people would joke that there must be a WhatsApp group for every demographic and every topic related to study in Germany. While in the Facebook groups, it was possible to write a post or respond to a post written by someone else, in the WhatsApp groups, it was possible to have a more chat-style conversation. The WhatsApp groups were significantly more active than the Facebook groups, with messages being exchanged between group members almost the entire day. Many of these WhatsApp groups had 257 members, which is the upper limit for a WhatsApp group. Strikingly, these groups were composed mainly of aspirant student migrants. Most of my interlocutors were members of 1 or 2 Facebook groups and then a handful of WhatsApp groups. So at the start of my fieldwork, I was very confused at the popularity of these Facebook and WhatsApp groups. And I kept wondering whether aspirants wouldn't be able to find more accurate information more easily if they just visited the websites of universities and of consulates, all of which have a lot of information in English, rather than seeking assistance from other applicants. However, as my fieldwork progressed, I understood that the value of these Facebook and WhatsApp groups stemmed from the fact that they did not just serve as a space where people could ask questions and get answers or broadcast useful information. Rather, these groups, particularly the WhatsApp groups, were used and experienced as co-working spaces of sorts, in which aspirants could actively collaborate on the application process and become part of a community which offered guidance and encouragement at every step. German universities have 2 intakes every year, a summer intake and a winter intake. As a result, WhatsApp groups were always populated with members who had different levels of experience with the application process. As one set of members were receiving their admission letters and flying off to Germany, another set of group members were still figuring out how to shortlist universities. Members who were more advanced in the application process, whom I call applicant veterans, were an important source of support and guidance for those who were less experienced, whom I call applicant freshers. As a result, even though these groups were largely composed of applicants, they functioned very effectively. Indeed, I would argue that these groups functioned like a community of practice. Etienne Wenger used the term communities of practice to describe groups which have 3 characteristic features. 1, a shared domain of interest. 2, members who interact, share information, help each other, and learn together. And 3, a shared repertoire of resources, such as experiences, stories, tools, and techniques for solving common problems. So in the next couple of slides, I'll give you a taste of how these social media groups I studied functioned as communities of practice. And I'll draw examples mainly from the WhatsApp groups. So to begin with, these groups were meeting aspirant student migrants' information needs in very novel ways. A number of strategies had evolved for information sharing. Firstly, the groups helped members to more efficiently navigate the huge amount, the sea of relevant information that was available on the internet. For instance, shortlisting universities and courses that matched one's interests, one's previous study, one's future plans, and also keeping track of application deadlines, eligibility criteria, application requirements, and so on, was seen as a really important but also very time-consuming task. Some group members had invested time in compiling spreadsheets of all the courses available in a particular discipline, complete with deadlines and other relevant details. And they would share links to these spreadsheets with the groups. Some groups would even jointly curate such spreadsheets. However, the groups also helped people access information and support that would have been less straightforward to otherwise access. For instance, filling out university application forms typically raised a lot of confusions, often, and the answers to which would not have really been easy to find on the internet. For instance, in many cases, the terminology that was used in these German university applications was unfamiliar to my interlocutors and required them to really translate between education systems. So a really common practice was that members would post a screenshot of their application form and write to the group, what do I write here? Which option do I choose? And within a few minutes, there would be several responses. Members would also help each other identify how to go about preparing supporting documents. One example that really stands out to me was when this one member had gone to a notary to get his transcripts notarized. And from the notary, he sent a frantic message to the whole group saying, guys, I'm in the notary. This is the stamp that the lawyer has put on my documents. Is it correct? And he sent an image of his recently stamped documents. And within a few minutes, another member sent an image of one of his own documents and the message, no, bro, that's wrong. This is how it's supposed to look. However, the groups could, in addition, also make accessible to members information that they would never have been able to access otherwise. For instance, the presence of a large number of applicants in the groups who were at different stages of the application process helped group members get insight into admission patterns and trends and evaluate their own chances of getting admission to various courses. So members would readily share their profiles with each other, and the term profile was used to refer to one's bachelor scores and any kind of relevant work and research experience one had. So they would readily share their profiles with each other, and in most groups there was a convention that when a person got an admission letter or a rejection letter from a university, they would immediately announce it to the group, often with a screenshot of the letter, and also include the details of their profiles. So my interlocutors would study these groups and analyze to which courses and to which universities people with similar profiles as theirs had got admission and where they had been rejected. Members would also share detailed accounts of their experiences of key steps of the application process. For instance, attending a visa interview was a task that many of my interlocutors found very stressful. A group member who had just attended a visa interview would write a long description of his or her experience and share it with the rest of the group. It was also not uncommon for members to write a line-by-line recap of the entire exchange they had had with the visa officer. And other members would analyze the questions that had been asked, the answers that had been provided, how these answers had been received by the visa officer. Alternate answers would be discussed. So through participation in these groups, an applicant could feel really well rehearsed before events that were experienced as being very stressful and very important. However, apart from the fact that a large body of information and knowledge and resources was being generated in these groups, for many of my interlocutors, belonging to these groups also felt like having a team of allies who were available for one around the clock. Group members used the word community and even family to refer to the group, and often used kinship terms in English and various Indian languages to refer to each other. One of the most striking dynamics of the groups for me was the ethic of encouragement and support that characterized them. Even though oftentimes these group members were direct competitors, they appeared to view each other as allies. People admired each other's profiles and they celebrated each other's victories. In informal interviews and conversations with me and in exchanges with each other, members typically presented their contributions to the group as being driven by a desire to give back. So for example, if you look in this screenshot, what's happening is that two group members are thanking a third group member who has just answered some questions they had. And this third group member replies at the bottom, "Hey guys, it's all my pleasure. Been through it, and I know sometimes we get silly doubts, but all you need is satisfaction of your own mind. Even I had these doubts in my mind when I applied, and someone cleared them for me. So I'm just carrying the legacy." In addition, having a tangible sense of a large and receptive audience, both people whom they knew through the groups, as well as a sort of imagined community of aspirant student migrants, which the groups had helped to create, made members interested in sharing information and helping each other. My interlocutors enjoyed the fact that the expertise that they had acquired and were acquiring in the course of their application journeys had tremendous exchange value in the groups in the form of gratitude and recognition from other group members. So group members who were very well informed about the nitty-gritty of the application process and who actively contributed to the groups were the most sought after and popular. In each of the groups I studied, there were several members who had come to be seen as community elders and study abroad gurus, even though many of them didn't have very impressive profiles academically. For instance, in one of the groups I studied, two members, whom I'll call Karan and Avinash, had emerged as study abroad gurus. And I'm just going to show you some quotes of the kind of appreciation they would get on a regular basis in the groups for their contributions to the groups. So here you have one member who writes in the group, "In football, we have Lionel Messi as greatest of all time. In cricket, we had Sachin Tendulkar as greatest of all time. And in German education, we have Karan Sir as greatest of all time." Similarly, another group member, Vishnu, in this quote is appreciating Avinash, a study abroad guru. Vishnu says, "At Avinash, I don't know if God is there or not, but Avinash is there to help us." And Avinash replies, "Anytime, bro, to help you guys." So watching people being admired and appreciated for their knowledge and their helpfulness also contributed to other group members wanting to become answerers of questions rather than just askers, and content producers rather than just content consumers. So people took a lot of pains to start contributing to the groups. Some members even became close friends with each other and began to interact outside the groups. For instance, I conducted an interview with one of these group members who was applying to a number of German universities. I'll call him Gopal. So Gopal came from a small village in the South Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. And through the groups, he had become good friends with another member who came from the state capital, Hyderabad. So in our interview, Gopal spoke of his friend like this. He says of this friend, "He is very close to me. He talks regularly with me on the phone. He's also applying for the same courses as me. We already told that if we got an admit in the same university, we should definitely go to that university. He suggested me many things. Actually, we're working together. The first person who comes to my mind when I have a doubt is him." Group members who lived in the same city also would often organize meetups with each other before going to Germany. And the vast majority of the Indian students that I interviewed in Germany had for the first time come to Germany with a large group of other students whom they had met through the groups. Also, very strikingly, at the time that I did my fieldwork, in certain big cities in Germany, it had become notoriously hard to find accommodation. And many of my interlocutors had stayed with their WhatsApp friends, as they refer to them, till they could find a place to stay. Many group members credited the groups with having prevented them from making errors and suboptimal decisions, and also with opening up new ideas and possibilities at various stages of the application process. Very importantly, many of my interlocutors described the groups as having made their application journeys much less stressful. So here you have Arif, one of my interlocutors, who says, "I felt that the Technical University of Munich group was like a collective mind. I have a problem, someone solves it for me. Someone else has a problem, I solve it. Similarly, Mansi says, it was a lonely and scary road before I found the groups. And then suddenly there were 100 people always there to help me. Indeed, the groups were perceived as being such a good source of information and guidance that many members saw them as a viable and even superior alternative to education consultancies. A number of my interlocutors had decided against going to education consultants because they felt that they would be able to more effectively navigate the application process with the help of the groups. There was a really strong anti-consultant narrative that had developed and crystallized in these groups. In fact, a regular joke was that these groups were the best consultant in India, with the highest rates of success in terms of admissions and visa approvals. So before I conclude, I just want to quickly flag up two things that I find striking about this case study. To go back to the very start of the presentation, I described how a lot of existing scholarship has suggested that latent ties, meaning people that one doesn't already know, latent ties activated through social media, are not having a very significant impact on facilitating migration because aspirant migrants, when they go on social media, are typically talking with people whom they already know. However, I think that what I've just presented is a very interesting case study of how Facebook and WhatsApp groups are enabling the activation of latent ties in a manner that has a major impact of on student mobility. Another thing that I want to flag up is that implicit and often explicit in a lot of the previous scholarship is that the type of latent ties that are useful for organizing migration are always people who have already migrated, so people who are already in the target destination. However, here again, it's a really interesting case study of how your fellow applicants can also be a really important latent tie that can get activated through a mutual help community of the kind that I've described. The second thing that I wanted to flag up is that these groups are more than just a place where people go to, ask questions and get answers, but rather they really function as communities of practice. And I stress this because it helps foreground how much informal and non-formal learning goes into going abroad to study, and how in order to go abroad to study, you really have to first study how to go abroad. So to conclude very quickly, I've tried to show you in today's webinar how whole new migration infrastructures are being created on social media platforms, which are meeting aspirant student migrants' information and support needs in really novel ways. Studies thus far have stressed that while social networks play a major role in mediating transnational student mobility, they also tend to reproduce privilege. These studies have argued that the social networks to which a person belongs and the social capital that they possess are closely linked to the economic and cultural capital they possess. However, in this paper, I've tried to show how these study in Germany Facebook and WhatsApp groups give members a chance to connect meaningfully and collaborate with people outside their existing social networks, and have thus dramatically increased their social capital and their ability to successfully navigate the process of going to Germany for study. And in this way, they can be seen as, at least to some extent, democratizing access to study abroad. I've also described how these social media spaces are sometimes discussed as being a superior alternative to education consultants, and how the kind of collective expertise of the social media groups are seen as being better than the traditional study abroad experts, the traditional education consultants. And in fact, a very strong anti-consultant narrative has crystallized in these groups. However, I don't mean to suggest that education consultants are no longer important, or that the migration infrastructure no longer involves these education consultants. Rather, in this project, I also found that new forms of education consultancy were developing in these social media spaces. And also there were very interesting links emerging between traditional education consultants in India and these kinds of mutual help groups. While the study in Germany focus groups I studied were started by Indians and composed largely of Indians, there were also a small number of people from other South Asian countries and even African countries, other global South countries, so to speak. There were people from these other countries in these groups too. So it appears that it is certain demographics that experience these groups as filling an important gap in the migration infrastructure that they are able to access. Also, while the fact that Germany is a relatively unfamiliar study destination for Indian students might have something to do with the popularity of these kind of social media infrastructures, I found that such groups also exist for people interested in studying in the US. And as of this year, these groups are also emerging for people who are interested in study in the UK. So I would argue that understanding student mobility from countries in the global South demands attention to these social media spaces. Finally, my very last point is that the current COVID crisis, as you can imagine, has created unprecedented disruptions in the application journeys of aspirant student migrants in India as well as all over the world. Because of the lockdown in India, there are people who haven't been able to submit their university applications because they haven't been able to write their IELTS exams. There are people who have admission letters from universities, but they haven't been able to apply for visas because the visa offices are closed. And there are even people who have visas, but that these visas are likely to expire before they can even leave India because of travel restrictions. There are all these really complex problems. And in such situations, these groups are once again a huge lifeline for many. This year, I've been doing a little bit of fieldwork in the groups, and I can see that people are strategizing with each other. People who write to a consulate immediately share the response from the consulate in a screenshot. Some groups are bringing people together to practice studying German to make the most use of this downtime. And perhaps most striking, some of the people I interviewed said that belonging to a social media group like this and seeing a lot of other people in the same boat as themselves had given them confidence to pursue their plans to study abroad. And they said that if they hadn't been part of this group, they might have seriously reconsidered whether it was such a wise decision to try and make such a big life step during a pandemic. So yeah, that's all. I will stop here. If you're interested, that's an article that discusses some of these themes in more detail. Feel free to get in touch if you would like to discuss any more about any of these topics. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sazana. And what a good talk, and you've sparked a great deal of interest. We've got about 12 questions on the chat, and we'd like to try something new today. If you can stay for a bit longer after 3 p.m. UK time.
Absolutely.
We'd like to keep the chat, the written chat open, so you can do more Q&A with the participants until about 3:30. So we'll turn the video off on the scheduled finishing time of 3 o'clock, but we'll keep the chat going. And I think we'll need that extra time because of so much discussion is coming through already. I'd like to ask Vimal Subramanian to ask the first question. So Vimal, unmute your mic and come in.
Yes. Hi, Sasha. It's a very, very insightful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions, if I can take the liberty. The first question is, did you see how were these groups moderated? One, and did you see examples of formalized groups by the university or the German government or embassy? And obviously, there would be a nature to cluster groups around that formal groups. And did you see formal groups being more popular than the informal groups and that kind of thing? So that's question number one. I don't know, that's a large question. Mm-hmm. So shall I ask the second question as well just now?
Sure, yeah.
The second question is, did you see any examples of these informal groups having large live sessions, like either on the platform, either on Facebook Live or WhatsApp group chat, or either outside the platform as a YouTube live session? Did they go outside the platform that they were using? So these are my two questions.
Okay, so about the administration of the groups. So typically this was quite voluntary. So there would be some enthusiastic members who would volunteer to be administrators, and they would be extremely strict in making sure that there was no irrelevant content. Sometimes we would have traditional education consultants infiltrating the group, and these administrators would immediately kick them out, and there would be people saying, admin, remove him, he's a consultant, he's trying to sell something. So there were people, it was typically people volunteering to be administrators, and they took these roles really seriously. There were some formal groups started by the universities, but these were either Facebook groups for anyone interested in studying in the university, and there were sometimes WhatsApp groups for people who already had admission. But from what I found, these groups were not as lively and as vibrant as the informal groups. Finally, your question about the live sessions kind of links to some of the other findings of the project that I couldn't discuss today. There are, in the case of study in Germany, at the time that I did fieldwork, a handful of YouTubers. So these were Indians who were currently studying in Germany, and it started YouTube channels to help others in India who want to come to Germany. And these were proper celebrities. They had their channels, one of them, who was one of the main case studies that I did, his channel had been viewed more than 10 million times. He had 100,000 subscribers. He was a proper celebrity. And so these YouTubers would conduct live sessions, and then that would become a forum where the whole community could come together and have a discussion. And then the community would talk among, all of the members would talk among each other too. But it was often these YouTubers who would create that space for a live session and this kind of a discussion. That happened a lot. I think I've answered all your questions.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vimal, and thank you, Sazana. Claire Callender's got the next question.
Well, thank you for a fascinating presentation. It's great. I mean, interestingly, the dominant narrative, especially now, about social media is that it's a key source of misinformation rather than good information, in inverted commas. And I was just wondering whether at any stage you assessed the accuracy of the practical information that was being given out rather than information that was just a sharing of feelings, etc. And I'd be interested in your response to that.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important question because obviously, yeah, that is the dominant narrative. And I think one of the good things about the group was that they had so many members, and all of this information sharing happened in public, so to speak. So if anyone shared something, there would be 200 other people reading what was shared. So in that way, it really discouraged people from, first of all, intentionally sharing misleading information. And even if people accidentally shared something that was not up to date or it was wrong for some reason, usually people would jump in and say, well, I don't think that's right. And even a person who would ask the question would wait till several people had responded to be happy to make sure that it was a accurate answer. Sometimes these study abroad gurus would be tagged. So people would say, I think this is how it works. At Avinash, am I right? At Karan, can you clarify? So there was a lot of kind of checking within the groups. And then sometimes the YouTube influencers would be called in who were seen as also very accurate, authentic sources of information. So there was lots of checks in place in an informal way. And I think that just the number of people in the groups helped any kind of wrong information be caught quickly and nipped in the bud.
Okay, but you didn't personally check it?
Well, I think a lot of the information was about the nitty-gritty of the application process. So it was often very technical information, like what is needed for this field, what is the new visa fee. And then there were also discussions about, you know, what kind of employment prospect courses have. And with these kind of things, it's very hard to know what is accurate. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Our next question is from Cora Shu. Hello, Cora.
Hello, Cora.
Hi, Sazana. Really great presentation. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I have two questions, but I'm only going to ask the first one, which is about the language. It's striking to see that, on these social media screens that you have captured to show us, it seems that the common language is English. And so, as I understand, in India, there are a lot of local languages. So, as a Chinese person, when I have anything to ask my fellow, friends, I will be definitely using Chinese. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the role of language in these social media groups.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So because these groups brought together people from across India, there was often no other common language other than English. So there were a few occasions where people would start talking in Hindi. So it would be in the English script, but they would be talking in Hindi. And then other group members would say, guys, please remember there are people from all over India here. We can't understand you. But there were also sometimes, as I said in the presentation, subgroups based on the city where you came from. So I was a part of a group of people from Karnataka, where the language spoken is Kannada. And so in that group, people could freely speak in Kannada. So yeah, I think that it was just that there wasn't another common language that everybody could understand.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Cora, and thanks, Sazana. Our next question is from Sylvie Loma.
Hi, that was a really fascinating presentation. So much rich data there.
Thank you.
So I have a question which is really more of an opinion question than maybe possible to answer from your data. So if you're not comfortable, that's totally fine. But do you think that the role of these groups was more important because Germany isn't such an established destination for Indian students? I mean,
yes.
This is starting to happen for UK students. So I'm interested in that comparison, I guess.
Yeah, so I think initially when I started, I assumed that maybe this was because Germany wasn't very well known, and also people don't know other people who have successfully completed a degree in Germany. And that's really important for having the confidence to go. So there's a joke in India that everybody knows somebody who's gone to the US to study, and so that's safe. So I think that was part of it, because in the groups, one of the big questions that people were always asking was, what kind of employment prospects? How is it going to be when we finish? How important is language, knowing German? Is there racism? So these kind of questions that typically weren't asked that much about US in the US groups were asked in Germany. But having said that, I did find that they were really active groups for people interested in study in the US, which is a really established destination. And since the UK introduced its post-study work visa, people are once again interested in the UK, which has resulted in these groups coming up. So I would say that probably going abroad to study anywhere, regardless of how familiar students are with the idea of this country, and regardless of the number of people they know who might have gone there in the past, it's still seen as really stressful. And the application process is seen as so complicated and so full of potential to go wrong that they feel that they need some sort of day-to-day guidance, which you cannot get from just a website, however informative the website is. And even people who knew someone who had gone abroad, often it wasn't the kind of deep contact where you could call them up and say, what do I write here? Or tell me about this again. And often they wouldn't even be aware of the latest, the minutiae of the application process. So I think that the popularity of these groups, more than the fact that Germany was not so well known, what they show is that the application process is experienced as requiring so much work and so much learning. And that all these countries, once you have a critical mass of people who are interested in going there, these groups come up. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sylvie, and thank you again, Sazana. Next question is from Miguel Lim.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you so much for your presentation. So a lot of rich data there. So my question was a little bit about the demographics of the participants, especially in these groups. And I think a couple of other colleagues also had those questions. My question was about gender. So it seems that a lot of your quotes, it's very interesting as well, the language that they use, the terms, bro language, rich. They seem to be male. One of my hypotheses is perhaps that has to do with Germany as a destination. I know from other anecdotal evidence that in study fairs, there's a kind of gendering of certain study destinations, at least in Europe, where Germany is seen as a science and technology country that appeals to certain genders. I think one of our colleagues also asked, wanted to piggyback on that demographic question to ask you about whether caste would play a role. I don't know whether she's comfortable using that term. And Cora also mentioned something about IELTS brides. But in any case, my question was about those demographics of your participants.
What was the last thing you said after caste? You said one more thing.
Well, Cora had a question about IELTS brides that she linked to my question. I'm not exactly sure what she meant. She could probably tell you later.
So maybe I'll answer your first two questions and then Cora could ask her question again. So with regard to gender, I think it's partly because Germany was seen as a destination for engineering students. So most of the people who go to Germany go to do an engineering course. And often they go to do, so the job market for engineers in India tends to be better for software engineers because of India's IT boom. And so if you're a software engineer, you can find a job in India, a good job in India. But if you're a mechanical engineer, a civil engineer, chemical engineer, you often really struggle to get a job in India. So it's typically people from these specializations of engineering that would go to Germany. And it so happens that most women in India who study engineering tend to study software engineering. That's seen as the female engineering stream, and streams like chemical and electrical engineering, civil engineering tend to be more male dominated. So I think it's partially because of this that most of the people who were going to Germany and who were in the groups were men. But I think it's also to do with the fact that more men than women go abroad from India in general.
Can I just follow up whether you felt that women felt excluded in the conversations because of the language?
Not really. So I think that, so for example, there would be some women in the group, and sometimes guys would write, not even noticing that these were women because they were mainly men. They would write, "Thanks, bro." And then sometimes the female member would reply, "You mean sis?" And you would say, "Oh, sorry, sis," you know. But so I don't think that the women necessarily explicitly discussed feeling excluded in any way, because they were also focused on this application process. We had one or two instances where there was a bit of harassment of women in the groups. So some women posted screenshots of how other group members had sent them private messages with inappropriate requests. So on one occasion, a woman posted a screenshot of how a group member had sent her a private message saying, "Do you want to have a hot chat?" And so she posted a screenshot of this to the whole group to shame that member. And then all the other men in the group called up that member and said, "Do you want to have a hot chat?" And so it was kind of shamed and shut down. So there were a few isolated incidents like this of women having these kind of unpleasant experiences in the group, but they were very rare and they immediately got shut down. And I didn't hear any women who explicitly discussed feeling excluded.
Thanks, Miguel. Thanks, Sazana. Next question from Katie Hyatt.
Thank you. Hi, Sazana. That was really interesting. Yeah, we spoke briefly on Twitter.
Yeah, it's nice to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to virtually meet you. My question comes from how this links to some of your previous work. So I'm wondering about how, or whether you've looked at this from a class perspective, in how these spaces might also provide guidance on not only practical information, but sort of behavior and navigation of spaces. Because people like David Sancho have written about how migration is tied to, you know, middle classness. But I wonder about how even these pre-migration spaces of social media support are also tied to these performances of or aspiration to middle classness, because even knowing how to negotiate and navigate these groups is also related to class, and not only through the use of English or specific types of English, but also maybe through knowing what type of questions to ask or how to interact with the other members or the sort of references to make. So I'm wondering if you've thought about how these are maybe spaces of class socialization, and if so, have you noticed any instances of I don't know how to phrase this, missteps of, you know, maybe members inadvertently revealing themselves as not quite performing middle classness successfully through perhaps not asking the right questions or not engaging with the other members in the ways that are expected in those spaces?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting question. Thank you. Actually, no. So it didn't feel like people felt that they had to kind of perform a certain identity or behave in a certain way in the groups. There was, however, I did notice that sometimes people were quite nervous about posting in the groups. So some of the people I interviewed said that for months they had just been completely silent readers, and they would just keep reading through the groups just to see how people interact, never daring to ask a question. Some of them would message me and send me a private message and say, can you please ask this question in the group? I'm a bit scared, my English isn't very good. And then I would say, no, don't worry. I mean, people are quite friendly in this group from what I can see, so you should just go ahead. And they would be like, please, just this once, can you ask it? Because I mean, I didn't have time to discuss this earlier, but I attracted quite a lot of attention in these groups because at the time I lived in Germany and I had a +49 number. So people thought, oh my God, there's a person from Germany in the group. So a lot of people would write to me and I would always tell them about my research and we would start a conversation. And on occasions like this, sometimes they would say, can you please check about this for me? And they wanted to make sure that they wouldn't be judged or they wouldn't be laughed at for sometimes not knowing good English or for not knowing how to phrase a question well. But I think that usually by just spending some time in the groups, people became more confident. And I witnessed people who were never talking and asking me to post questions become the group admin after a few months. So that was really interesting. And they were also very honest with each other. Sometimes the groups would be discussing, you know, how to get a loan, and people would reveal their financial status to each other and how they were having to mortgage agricultural land in order to be able to get a loan that they needed for visa purposes. There was a lot of openness and not much of this performative kind of thing at all.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Katie, and thank you, Sazana, again. Our next on my call list is Cleo Fattorecci.
Hi, thank you. Hi. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I was just wondering about the groups, and I'm very sorry if I maybe missed this information at the beginning of your talk, but how did the participants learn about the groups? Where were they flagged? How did they, because I understand that it was all very informal and it wasn't ruled by the university or the government or anybody. But yeah, how did they hear about it in the first place? It would be really interesting.
So I think, thanks for the question. I think that these days people assume that there must be a Facebook group for everything. So they would typically go on to Facebook and they would look for groups about going to Germany. And then they would quite easily find usually a closed group for some kind of MS in Germany, Indian students in Germany, request permission. And once they were in those groups, they would see people advertising WhatsApp groups. And then you can just jump into these rabbit holes of WhatsApp groups. And from this WhatsApp group, you would find links to other more specialized ones. And so once you're in the Facebook groups, that suddenly opens up all these avenues to various WhatsApp groups. So that's typically how it happened. And sometimes people would write in the Facebook group, is there a WhatsApp group for people applying for computer science courses at the University of Stuttgart? And then someone would say, here's the link. So. You.
Well, thanks. Our next question is from Doria Abdallah.
Hi, Sazana. Doria from Malaysia. Thank you so much for your presentation. Perhaps I can start this off with a comment because I noticed in a few responses that you give just now, you're talking about how every member of the WhatsApp group are regulating each other for good behavior or for bad behavior. Perhaps that's another field altogether. It's actually from policy studies, so you can just explore that. It can be a new field altogether for you to write. Now, my question comes on implication for practice. For me, it might explain why Malaysia, it's very hard for Malaysia to penetrate the Indian market because we use a lot of education agents. So the question is, should universities in Germany work directly with these groups instead of employing the education agents? Because it might be more effective rather than, going for education fairs, putting investment in terms of marketing. This group seems to be more effective than former channels. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. So I think the question is whether German universities really need to recruit students. So they don't really, most of the state-run universities typically don't go to fairs because education is free. The demand is much more than what they can even accept. So they are increasing their selection criteria every year because they just have so many applicants from India applying. So they, I think, don't really have a need to actively recruit the way that the UK, for example, does. When I've presented this research to stakeholders, so the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, the question they asked me is that, can we offer some of the services that these groups offer if it's so helpful to students? And what I discussed with them was that actually it doesn't really make sense for the German government funded body to be sitting with every single applicant and kind of telling them what to fill out everywhere, because that's just too much work. And I think that maybe we should just let these groups be and let them do what they're doing, because they're doing it quite well. And they're helping each other, they find it interesting, they're getting support, and it doesn't really make sense to try to institutionalize that in that sense. So hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Doria, and nice to have you on again after last week. Last question in the video will be from James Robson. I think after that we'll have to close the webinar.
Thank you. Oh, fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for and your data is so rich and interesting. Part of that richness makes me really fascinated by the identity issue that's going on here, and you started touching on it in relation to Katie's question. But your communities of practice theory has a big part dedicated to identity, particularly in Leuven-Wenger's original conceptualization. So I'm really interested in how you see engagement in these kinds of spaces as part of identity construction and particularly identity performance, and how this sort of contributes to individuals' self-formation through use of these spaces.
Thank you. So I guess one thing, because it's a very long answer, but just one point that I think might be interesting to discuss is how many people would find these groups, people in small villages, small towns, who had just the sort of beginnings of the idea of, could I potentially study in Germany? So they would find these groups at that stage. And spending time in the groups, they would start to really believe that, yeah, actually, I could go to Germany. I could imagine being one of these international students studying in Germany. And so I think that was one thing that I found really interesting. That the fact that German education is so affordable made some people enter these groups with, just the idea that maybe. And then spending time in these groups made it feel very concrete, because you could just see all these other people, just like you, not from rich families all the time, people who were at just regular universities, all with this crazy plan of going across the world. And suddenly it felt like it would be possible by these concrete interactions in the group. So I think for a lot of people, it created a lot of confidence and made it feel like a viable option. And so in that sense, changed their identity from being someone who thought maybe to someone who felt like they were a legitimate prospective international student. that answers your question.
You know, there's a whole paper in that question, isn't there?
Yes.
But look, Sazana, I want to very sincerely thank you. I thought, you know, your participation today was really valuable, and everyone was very interested in the presentation and in the Q&A. You know, it was really good to have you on the show. And we had a lot of interest. I mean, there was, you know, 79 people at the peak.
That's amazing.
And we're still holding 60 or more than that now. We'll have to close the video audio part of the webinar, but we can now go on to the chat section of your screen, and there's a lot of Q&A there which has not yet been addressed. I must apologise to SY Co and Cassie Jiang and others that I didn't have time to bring in, but there's certainly some good questions there. So take a breath, have a look at what's there, and then start the process of typing back.
Thank you
and
so
see
much.
What happens from there. So hope we'll have you on again. And again, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the forum.
We are closing. Next week, we have 2 webinars on Tuesday and Thursday. Be there.